Hello and welcome to Plant Pod. I'm Robert Romej. We've got Makenna Ayres and Brian Hook. How you guys doing today?
Doing well.
So good.
Yeah. Well, we just came out of our Kingdom Framework series, so we finished that up. And right now in our own church, we are getting ready to continue, not getting ready to, but we're continuing through 1 Corinthians. And so what we're going to do today is talk through some of the stuff of like right where we're at. And that's kind of for multiple reasons, right, Brian?
It is. I mean, number one, it's a short week. So sometimes with a short week, this is just for planters out there. If you're thinking about like starting a church and you realize, oh no, I've got to preach every week. Sometimes you have short weeks. Like this is a July 4th week. I don't know when this is going to come out, but we want to get this done by today. Like my sermon needs to get done today so I can enjoy the family, have some hot dogs, play with the dogs, go up to the mountains, enjoy myself. So sometimes when that happens and you're called to maybe do something else, like speak at an event or something like that, sometimes you can just preach on what you're doing at that moment. And so I think it's really good sometimes to just say, okay, where am I in my sermon series? Mm-hmm. And if it's pertinent to where we are, preach it. And quite frankly, where we are right now is very pertinent to where we are. Mm-hmm. This is the first point. It's exactly where we are with the Kingdom Framework, and it's a great follow-up of Kingdom Framework. So primarily, it's because that's where we are. Mm-hmm. And secondarily, it's a great really follow-up.
Well. Yeah, it fits really well with what we just came off. So we are in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. So for those of you listening on in, we're going to start by having Makenna read 1 Corinthians 3, 5 through 9.
All right. What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. He who plants and he who waters are one, and each will receive his wages according to his labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building.
Awesome. Thanks for reading that. I think what we should do is first just give a little bit of context for this letter in general, so that way we won't get too pigeonholed into just thinking of what we came off of, which is church. We came off of talking about church. So can you guys share a little bit of insights, maybe all of us can, on what this letter is? Makenna, you want to kick us off?
Yeah. So Paul is writing to the church in Corinth here. And even though it's 1 Corinthians, this is actually his second letter to the Corinthians because there are 4 of them. And so he's writing to these believers in Corinth, and there's been a lot of division between the body of kind of these different factions of who they're maybe kind of vibing with a little bit more. Like, I like when Apollos is preaching, maybe not so much Paul, or, I really like Paul, but I don't like Apollos or whatever. And so that's kind of the background in the couple chapters leading up to where we are now. And Paul's trying to give a little perspective on perhaps why that is not the best view to be having in a church body.
Which is funny to think about it, because Paul's the one writing this letter,
right.
And they are kind of, how awkward, right? And today, like thinking about a pastor today writing to a church they planted and being like, what do you mean you don't like me? Let's talk about that a little bit. That's what I'm picturing happening. Let's get into that. So, no, that's really good. That's helpful. Another thing that I've learned as we've been looking into it is that Corinth had a good mixture of some Romans. We had some Greeks. There were some Jews. And so, Greeks kind of liked their philosophy. Romans had their structure. Jews, in the Old Testament type stuff. So each one, they just had these different mindsets. And so he's addressing a lot of people who are now believers, but yet, they're getting divided. So it's it helps to know, like, oh, there's a lot of different mindsets, in this.
Yeah, like reconciling that diversity.
And so no wonder why they like maybe different preachers or different things going on in here. So coming out of church planning conversation, Brian, what kind of things in this passage do you see as kind of just flows right into what we talked about?
Yeah, he mixes something that we see throughout the New Testament, and that is sometimes we're talking about planting and this organic life, right? I'm the vine, you're the branches, field, the different kinds of soil Jesus talks about in his first parable that says, hey, you got to get this one. He talks about the 4 different types of soil. Always mixing in these dynamics of gardening and planting. And then we call ourselves church planters. So that's where we get it. The fact is, we're sowing seeds, and there's a planting dynamic involved. And then he mixes it a little bit in verse 9, where he says, God's field, God's building. So now we're talking about this idea of building. And both these concepts are concepts that I think the Corinthians would understand.
Yeah.
You know, that things are grown. You know, I mean, we go to the store and we get our stuff and we think, you know, I wonder who grew that or how'd that happen? Or and you really don't know that kind of stuff until you plant something. And so he is talking to people that would know things about the field as well as the building. So he understands. And then later he goes into some of the dynamics of that building, from gold, silver, stones, wood, hay, straw. So that's in verse 12. So he even goes down to the specifics of the type of materials used in the building. And I love how he uses this, because it helps us understand that the work of the church and what we're called to do really is organic. It's not just physical, stagnant, right? Like, there's a person. Well, there is a person, and that is a number, you know, or a family comes in of 5 or 6, but each one is organic. Each one has a spirit of the world or spirit of God, and we're trying to determine what that is. And then when they give their lives to Christ, now we're talking about a building that's happening and a church plant that's developing. So all that's organic. And so he does a great job in, first and foremost, talking about this planting and the seeds and Apollos watering it. But I love this. God is the one that makes it grow. Yeah. Then he goes on in verse 7, God who makes things grow. Everything comes back to it. Verse 11 talks about the foundation, which is Jesus Christ. So he keeps coming back over and over again, reminding us that we're just servants, and it's all about God. And I think that as we move forward as church planters, it's so important to know that this is a organic building, and that literally there is nothing we can do apart from Christ. And our job, really, according to this passage, is to begin with humility, because it will outlive you. You know, let's build something that outlives you. Let's build something that's not about you. Why are we planting a church in the first place? Unfortunately, sometimes people will plant for their own gain and their own acknowledgement, for their own glory, you know. And I've seen people start churches or even pastor churches, and it grows, and they may have started out with the right heart, but at some point when success begins to creep in, God's doing what he's doing, they take credit for it, you know?
Sure.
And we see that even before time began with Satan.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, who is Satan to start taking credit for being the worship leader, right? And, you know, he's putting himself on the caliber of God. And then, you know, you see these stories in the Old Testament of Nebuchadnezzar and, making this huge empire called Babylon, taking credit for it, you know? And so, yeah.
No, that's good. I think what also stands out to me as we're reading in the very first verse is, what then is Apollos, what then is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, as the Lord assigned to each. So that last part, as the Lord assigned to each. Because then he goes on to say that I, meaning Paul, I planted, Apollos watered. And he's not saying one is better than the other. Yeah. He's just saying as the Lord assigned to each. So in a previous episode, it kind of stuck with me that, hey, there might be someone out there like a Paul who's super good at planting churches. Sure. But there might be an Apollos, let's say, that is really good at pastoring a church that has been planted, but maybe isn't the best at planting, you know, and I don't know if that's really analogous or not. I'm not a big plant person. When I say that, like actual plants, you know? I don't know. Maybe some people are really good at planting, and some, I definitely forget to water plants, so I know I'm not good at that. But, you know, bringing that into the context of actual churches, there might be really good pastors and people who are really good at getting things started and all of the things that entails for the first year, 2, 3 years. Yeah. I just think that that's applicable definitely to a church planter. So it's a perfect as we're talking about church planting. Yeah,
I mean, I'd be interested to hear about your planting experiences. You plant things, Makenna?
You're talking about like physical plants? Yeah, I feel like we talked about this. Our plans didn't do well on the
that's right.
drive from California after they made peace
Hard
with
to
the
move 'em over
California.
here. Yeah.
They didn't like coming to the desert. Crazy, right? Like going from really nice weather that's the same
They didn't
all
stop
year
you at the
round
border and say, "Are you bringing anything over?" And
No, but I was kind of worried. I was
Yeah.
like, is this illegal? I don't think we had them in the trunk, which also maybe wasn't a.
That probably didn't help your plans.
But right, as far as like actually planting things, we used to do a garden every year back home with my parents, and we had like this old jacuzzi that we renovated to be a like above ground garden.
oh wow,
And we kind of had the opposite problem. Everything just got so huge. We'd plant like zucchinis and green onions and squash, and it would get gigantic. It looked like it was like straight out of Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, like just these ridiculously sized vegetables, and we weren't trying to do that.
Yeah.
So kind of the opposite problem now, of where everything is dying. We weren't even like paying attention to it, and somehow we have like these 4-foot long zucchinis just
God still did the
coming out
growth.
of the. God still did the growth.
yeah. It's such a weird. We're talking about our experiences, but the analogy does play out. Like,
Yeah.
like I've never really planted anything until I moved here that actually lived, right? So when I moved here, we were praying through just the city. We were praying through. Some gentlemen came out and they were partnering church, and they said, what do you want us to do? And I didn't have anything for them to do. I was busy planting a church. So sometimes partners will come out and they're like, and if you're one of our partners listening, I'm so sorry, but sometimes you're like, I wish they weren't coming this week, because you have to entertain a little bit. You have to, be there for them, and nothing wrong with that. And you feel obligated. And fortunately, we've had the most amazing partners that, and when they show up, they say, "Listen, we're not here to be a burden." And this was one of those teams. And I said, "You know what? I just would love to just pray over our city. I haven't done enough of that." And so we were praying, and we came upon a garden, which was behind the school that our kids were attending. And it turns out it was a community garden, and they invited us in, and they told us a little bit about the community garden. His name was Tony, and we began to just dialogue with him about the garden and get to know him. And he said, "Would you guys like to have a plot of land here in this garden?" And I'm like, "This is cool. Move." It's like it took me back to the 1800s. A plot of land. I put down my stake. I've got my own land. I mean,
You become a lord over that section of the garden.
yes. And so I had like a little bit of a space. We paid $50 a month, and we started gardening. And everything was done for us. So they brought in the water. They watered it for us. It was like when you go fishing and they bait the hook for you and reel the fish in. And then
what part did you do?
And you hold up the fish. And I think planting is kind of like that. We had to put the seeds in there, and even the small little things that I was called to do, I messed up on. That first batch was just terrible. And the person that was helping me in the garden, he's like, you really shouldn't plant those seeds at this time. You didn't put the seed in deep enough into the soil. You didn't fertilize the soil. You didn't, and all these things that I didn't do.
Into it.
That third batch we were planting, and things were happening. And, that third time around, I started taking credit for it. I started taking pictures. I started posting it. Look at the zucchini.
My tomatoes.
Look at the tomatoes that I did, that I grew.
My tomatoes.
And I think sometimes we do that in church planting. We may have a failure here or there, but when the numbers come and the baptisms come, or it's like, I did it. Mm-hmm. And Paul's reminding them, you didn't do it. Mm-hmm. You didn't. You really. The soil's not yours. It was given to you. You're a steward of that. You didn't make the seeds. That's from God. And even the seed you do plant, it breaks forth and, it emerges. So, if anything, that we are a seed, and he tells us the thing that you need to do is die.
Right.
So even the organic dynamic of us planting is, our job is to die. His job is to grow.
Yeah.
And so it's a great passage. It's a great reminder to us, I think. But that's my experience of planting.
No, that's really helpful.
But I think you have to know how to plant something. And I would encourage all church planters to start growing some things, really growing some things. Actually growing some things. You will learn some things.
I bet. I could definitely picture that.
About that.
Force you to slow down, try to plant something, and just get the analogy rooted in there.
So many, if you forget to water, things start happening with your congregation. Like, I don't think I'm watering. Sometimes the fruit starts just bursting forth and you don't go check on it. And before long, you find out it's on the ground or it's ruined. And you let some fruit just kind of die. And, it's just, you need to prune it on a regular basis. And all those things are in Scripture.
Yeah.
This passage is very applicable to people who are planting churches because Paul literally did that, right? Like, he actually went and planted churches. And I don't think that I really realized that there was that much evidence of churches being planted when I was growing up. And now it's hard not to see it, all these letters that Paul writes to people. But on the other hand, too, I also think as he's writing to people, in some ways I can also feel like I can apply this to myself, whether I'm planning a church or not. Do you think that each person can make this at least somewhat individually applicable?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think, did we do a whole episode on evangelism? I remember bringing this up when we were talking about evangelism. I don't remember if that was the whole...
Remind us.
Yeah, so this is actually, I don't have it highlighted in this Bible, but in my like personal devotional Bible, I have it highlighted, particularly with evangelism in mind. And so this passage is so encouraging to me through the lens of evangelism, because it's a really sweet reminder that if I'm evangelizing to people and I'm sharing the gospel with people, typically I'm not going to be the one that sees them to come to Christ, which at first can seem really discouraging, right? Because you're faithfully sharing the gospel and you're pouring out and pouring out and pouring out, and it seems like nothing's happening. And that can be really discouraging, right? Like, I think about the times that, you plant seeds and it's like, well, like, is anything ever going to happen? Like, is this going to grow? Is it not going to grow? And yet, because God is the one who gives growth, He's the one that is placing other believers in their lives to water that seed that you planted. And maybe one day that you do get to see that person come to Christ if you're still in the same circles. But most of the time, it's not going to be you. But I think it's really cool in verse, which one is it? It says, he who plants and he who waters are one, in verse 8. And so I think that's really cool too, because
that's a great passage.
It absolutely destroys any semblance of hierarchy. It's not like the one who plants is, like better than the one who's just coming along to water, or vice versa, or whatever. It absolutely destroys that notion, saying that all of this work that we're doing through this kingdom lens of co-laboring with God, we are one in doing that. And so a planter is not any better than a pastor, or a pastor is not any better than a planter, any just layman in the church. All of us are on mission together in unity, which is like the purpose of this whole passage, right, is to unify the body. And so I just think that's such an encouraging passage for anyone within the church, because we're all called to share the gospel, right? Like, that's why we're here, is like to expand the kingdom. And so I just think it's so encouraging knowing that at whatever point, if you're the one planting the seed, or you're coming along a believer who's had that, or a non-believer who's been exposed to the gospel, and you're watering that, wherever you are in that process, it's valuable, and fruit really will come out of that. And it's just so cool to see that all work out. And sometimes you get to see it work out, and sometimes you don't, but there is just so much hope knowing that God is the one who gives the growth. So it's not up to me to force it to happen.
Yeah. I think that's really helpful to put it into context, because we do often elevate maybe one or the other. Oh man, you're so good at telling people about Jesus for the first time, or you're so good about bringing it up in normal conversation, which is a good skill to have in general. But you got to witness X amount of people come to know Jesus because you talked to them, and those are just maybe different stages. And I remember a couple of years ago when I was working at my engineering job, and I ran across someone who was just trying to get some work done, and all of a sudden they brought up something about church, and it was very obvious that someone had planted seeds, because I wasn't the one that was talking about it, but I kind of just started dialoguing with them, and before I knew it, an hour goes by, and they're asking all sorts of questions and things, and I look back at that as a moment of I got to water something. I was not expecting it. I was just trying to do my work, and I had a great conversation. But someone, don't know who, someone out there planted those seeds.
Yeah.
And I don't know whatever came of that. I was hopeful. I kind of continued to follow up. It didn't go. Maybe it did go somewhere. I don't know, but not from what I got to see. And that helps me remember. It's very encouraging to think of that time, because I think there's different seasons where we maybe do some planting, we do some watering, because just in the past couple of weeks, I got a chance to talk to some friends and maybe plant some seeds. And my prayer now is that someone is going to do the watering. Maybe it'll be me, but it probably won't be, right?
Yeah.
So that's helpful. I appreciate you bringing that up, and it is encouraging on an individual level to remember that neither one is necessarily greater. God's going to do the growth. And sometimes whether we forget to water or not, that still happens, like we were talking about.
Yeah.
So that is helpful.
And I think all of us can do it. To Makenna's point, all of us can have a part in planting seeds and watering, and we get to celebrate that. And I think humility is important. Sometimes I remember as a young Christian almost having a quota for leading, and I actually had a class that had a quota number that, not so much that they were saved, because I can't save, but in sharing, but in the midst of that quota, you really did want to see people come to know Christ, and you really did want to be the person to do it. And I just remember, sometimes I'll be sharing and somebody already was a Christian, and I wouldn't take that as valid. And I'd try to lead the Christian to Christ, because I'm like, no, I got to get through this. You know what I mean? And I think that
let me share the gospel.
Yes, and I think in some ways, what is that about? That's really about pride. And Paul is really correcting these Christians about, hey, be careful about criticizing the servants of the Lord, because they're all on the same team. And we have to be careful as planners not to be prideful in that regard, making sure that those in our church are not prideful, that we're just simply watering and we're simply planting, and God gets the increase and the growth. And I think that's really vital as it relates to planting, because you're going to raise up some people in your church, and they may move to another area of your city, and somebody else will get to water, and they'll begin to grow, and you're like, wow, they're growing more than they did at my church. You have to be careful, and it can kind of hurt a little bit. Or somebody may leave your church for whatever reason, and it's hard, and you're like, you know what? You just are faithful with what you do, and you plant the seed, and you allow the Lord to work in that person's life, and you just trust God. And I think as planters, it's so hard sometimes, because you're working so hard, and you look at the bigger picture in the city. And we do want people to be in local churches and being discipled in local churches and not move around. I think that's very important, and we're seeing that rampant today. Most people aren't necessarily moving to another church; they're just moving out of church altogether, and that's bad. But there are times, though, when people will move to other churches, and some churches have tremendous evangelists as pastors, but then there may be another church that goes much deeper, and they may need that. They may need that person that goes deeper in that word. And, in Dallas, Texas, I remember just having numerous great biblical teachers. And I just remember there also were some great evangelists, and they shared the gospel every single week. It's like, okay, I'm saved every week. And people would constantly be getting saved. And then sometimes people would move to another church. And you know what? God gets the glory.
Yeah.
And you just have to be okay with that.
Yeah. Work with what you do have. Yeah, that would be a really tough one, though, as a church.
It is, but I think planners know what I'm talking about. When especially if you've been in it a couple of years, you realize. And sometimes you just lose people too, because you don't have a building. You're trying. You're wearing 18 different hats, and those planners out there, you have to trust and know that do what God's called you to do. Do your gifting, and don't worry about it.
That's good.
Just it's not about you, anyways. It's about God.
That's good. One of the parts in here in verse 9, I just want to point out, because it's one of my favorite parts in this whole passage. So I'm going to reread it. 1 Corinthians 3:9, it says, "For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building." I took a little class, haven't finished it yet, but in 1 Corinthians, and it had talked about how fellow workers, the Greek word is synergos. I'm sure I'm butchering that. But anyway, the word is like co-laborer. And I love that. I don't know about you guys. Like, I'd love to hear what you guys think, but like the fact that we are God's co-labor, like we get to co-labor with God. I mean, I don't know about you. Like, I've had a lot of coworkers in the past, but to call God a co-worker, like that's kind of cool, right? I don't know. There's something exciting to that, that we get to labor alongside, that we're not doing this by ourselves, that he didn't say, okay, now you go and do it, or I've got this. It's neither one of those extremes. It's in the middle. Yeah. It also just reminds me a lot of, I don't know, the first couple pages of the Bible, where God actually tells Adam, like, all right, I want you to do this with me. I want you to rule and reign with me. Like, you know, you're gonna name the animals. Like, well, God could have done that. He made them, right? So I just think it's really cool that we get to do that. And I think when I think of it that way, when I think about whether I'm watering or planting, then I'm like, I'm regardless of which one I am and what other people are doing, I get to do this. I'm co-laboring with Father. That's pretty cool. I don't know. Do you guys have anything to add to that? But
I think it is good to have that, and it's a continual reemphasis of servanthood and humbling ourselves. Even our Savior humbled himself and was a servant, and calls us brothers. And I mean, that's, who in the world are we? We don't deserve to be called brothers and sisters of Christ, and to have that title of being co-laborers. And I think that it just reminds us that we're all in this together. And some of these things that we see planted will never see the growth nor the harvest. And that's tough for church planters. It just reminds me, though, of the biblical way to plant. And really the biblical way is, if you were younger, if I was to do it all over again and be 25, 30, 35, I think I would try to plant as many churches as I can during those early years, because that's the biblical model. The biblical model isn't so much plant a church and stay there forever. And that really goes against what people are taught. People are taught plant a church, stay long term. That's a great idea, but that's not how Paul did it. Paul planted, even late in his life, planted and wanted to continue to plant. And it was his desire in Romans 15:20. He aspired to preach the gospel, not laying on another man's foundation. What he's talking about there is not so much Jesus as the foundation. He was talking about another man's work. He didn't want to go there and pastor. He wanted to go and plant and plant and plant. He wanted to keep doing it. And for those listening, and you may never see really the long-term growth and even harvest of some things that you plant. And missionaries to a person, whether they've served and they've written in their journals or they're serving now, many of them never see somebody come to know Christ. They plant seeds, and then somebody else comes along and waters, and somebody else gets the harvest. And you have to be okay with that. If you're not okay with that, church planting is not for you.
That's really helpful too. I mean, what I hear you saying is figure out what you're gifted at, and if you're gifted at planting, then go and
do it.
Do it.
And I think on an individual level, I think that speaks to us as individuals too. Plant. Don't worry about seeing the growth. Growth happens. You're going to disciple them, and you're going to disciple them and disciple them. But at the end of the day, you leave that up to the Lord. Sometimes growth happens and you don't see it, you know?
Well, I think that too, it also just leaves a lot of space for, okay, well, what if that's not my gifting and it isn't planting? Well, there's a whole lot of other things that the planter needs some help with, right? You need someone that's going to come and water it, and people who are going to disciple, and people who are going to, fill in the gaps that the planter isn't going to do, because he's going to keep planting.
Absolutely.
That's fun, right? That sounds like a really good time. Sounds like a good time.
I think if you take that approach with humility and you're teaching people with their gifts, that way they come at it with humility and they understand that my gifts are to be used for, whether it be evangelism, whether it be teaching, whether it be discipling, whether it be pastoring. Those are the things I'm going to do for God's glory no matter what. I'm going to leave the results to God. And that's what Paul has to deal with in 1 Corinthians 14, and 12 as well. And that's why he has 1 Corinthians 13. He talks about love,
Well, as you're looking at this passage, we only read 5 through 9, Brian, and I know that you're preparing for your sermon, which is more. I think you're going to go for more. This is good.
It's coming together.
What is one thing in these 4 verses, 5 verses that we just read that you would want to be like at least one thing that people would take away?
I think over and over again, God makes it grow. God has been making it grow. God's the one. An emphasis on God and emphasis on us as servants. So, you know, if you don't look at God as being the main thing, you'll get your eye off the ball. It's very similar. It'd be like going to a restaurant and ordering food, and you hear about this incredible food that's there, and it's incredible, and it's awesome. It's the best food you've ever tasted in your life. Yet you spend the entire hour talking about the servants at how they serve the table. You know, that's what they're doing. Like did you see how they brought my plate? Did you see how they bust the table for us? Did you see how they poured my glass? Instead of saying, wow, the food was really good. And that's what Paul's saying here is like the main thing is God. And you're talking about the servants. And I think the one thing that stands out here is the servants are not the thing. It's about God.
Yeah.
And to me, that's church planners too. Like, you're not it. You're not the goal. The goal is God.
That is a really good analogy, but I guess that means that God is the food. Is that what you're saying?
Hey, says he's the bread of life.
Amen.
Right?
Full circle.
Come on now.
Right
He's
the
back
bread
to
of life.
Scripture.
Yeah.
He's preaching.
Yeah.
Man.
Taste and see, right? That the Lord is
So
good.
just focus on the bread on the table, not the one who delivered the bread.
Who cares about the one that delivered the bread? Who
You can't
cares?
get too deep into that. Tip your servers well, people.
Tip your servers well.
That's true.
And by the way,
Paul
not to
said to
take
do that too, actually.
They're worthy of their wages.
They're worthy of their
Come
wages.
on. This is working so much
Yes,
better
it
than I
is.
expected it to.
There you go.
I think that's in Corinthians as well. I could be wrong about
It
that.
is. It is.
I'm pretty sure it's at the end of it, like 13, 14. Wow, way to go. No, that's good. I think that's a good place to end this episode, and we're going to continue on through a little bit more of 1 Corinthians on the next one. So thank you guys for joining in on this.